Okay, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to actually be reading more scary stories, but we're actually going to read not something online, but in a book. It's called Victorian Ghost Stories, an Oxford anthology. It's not as boring as it sounds, but there are a lot of big words, so hopefully you can understand it. It comes with a bunch of little stories inside it, and the story that I chose to read I've already read so far, and it's actually really good. It's called The Old Nurse's Story. It was set back in 1852. It's by Elizabeth Gaskell. You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphan and an only child, and I dare say you have heard that your grandfather was a clergyman up in Westmoreland, where I come from. I was just a girl in the village school when one day your grandfather came in to ask the mistress if there was any scholar there who would do for a nursemaid. And mighty proud I was, I can tell ye, when the mistress called me up and spoke to me, being a good girl at my needle, and a steady, honest girl, and one whose parents were very respectable, though they might be poor. I thought I should like nothing better than to serve the pretty young lady, who was blushing as deep as I was as she spoke of the coming baby and what I should have to do with it. However, I see you don't care so much for this part of my story as for what you think is to come, so I'll tell you at once. I was engaged and settled at the parsonage before Mrs. Rosamond, that was the baby who is now your mother, was born. To be sure, I had little enough to do with her when she came, for she was never out of her mother's arms, and slept by her all night long. And proud enough was I sometimes when Mrs. trusted her to me. There never was such a baby before or since. The you've all of you been fine enough in your turns, but for sweet winning ways you've none of you come up to your mother. She took after her mother, who was a real lady born, a Miss Furnivall, a granddaughter of Lord Furnivall's in Northumberland. I believe she had neither brother nor sister, and had been brought up in my lord's family till she had married your father, who was just a curate, son to a shopkeeper in Carlisle, but a clever fine gentleman as ever was, and one who was a right down hard worker in his parish, which is very wide and scattered all abroad over the Westmoreland fells. When your mother, little Mrs. Rosamond, was about 4 or 5 years old, both her parents died in a fortnight, one after the other. Ah, that was a sad time. My pretty young mistress and me was looking for another baby, when my master came home from one of his long rides, wet and tired, and took the fever he died of. And then she never held up her head again, but just lived to see her dead baby and have it laid on her breast before she sighed away her life. My mistress asked me on her deathbed never to leave Mrs. Rosamond, but if she had never spoken a word, I would have gone with the little child to the end of the world. The next thing, and before we had well stilled our sobs, the executors and guardians came to settle the affairs. They were my poor young mistress's own cousin, Lord Furnivall, and Mr. Esthwaite, my master's brother, a shopkeeper in Manchester, not so well to do then as he was afterward, and with a large family rising above him. Well, I don't know if it were their settling, or because of a letter my mistress wrote on her deathbed to her cousin, my lord But somehow it was settled that Mrs. Rosamond and me were to go to Furnivall Manor House in Northumberland, and my lord spoke as if it had been her mother's wish that she would live with his family, and as if he had no objections for that, one or two more or less could make no difference in so grand a household. So thou, so though so thou that was not the way in which I should have wished the coming of my bright and pretty pet to have been looked at, who was like a sunbeam in any family. Be it never so grand, I was well pleased that all the folks in the dale should stare and admire when they heard I was going to be young lady's maid at my Lord Furnivall's at Furnivall Manor. But I made a mistake in thinking we were to go and live where my lord did. It turned out that the family had left Furnivall Manor's house 50 years or more. I could not hear that my poor young mistress had ever been there, though she had been brought up in the family, and I was sorry for that, for I should have liked Mrs. Rosamond's youth to have passed where her mother's had been. My lord's gentleman, from whom I asked so many questions as I durst, said the manor house was at the foot of the Cumberland Fells, and a very grand place, that an old Mrs. Furnivall, a great aunt of my lord's, lived there, with only a few servants, but that it was a very healthy place, and my lord had thought that it would suit Mrs. Rosamond very well for a few years, and that her being there might perhaps amuse his old aunt. I was bidden by my lord to have Mrs. Rosamond's things ready by a certain day. He was a stern, proud man, so they say all the lords Furnivall and he never spoke a word more than was necessary. Folk didn't say he had loved my young mistress, but that because she knew that his father would object, she would never listen to him, and married Mr. Esthwaite. But I don't know. He never married at any rate. But he never took much notice of Mrs. Rosamond, which I thought he might have done if he had cared for her dead mother. He sent his gentleman with us to the manor house, telling him to join him at Newcastle that same evening, so there was no great length of time for him to make us known to all the strangers before he too shook us off, and we were left, two lonely young things, I was not 18, in the great old manor house. It seems like yesterday that we drove there. We had left our own dear parsonage very early, and we had both cried as if our hearts would break that we were traveling in my lord's carriage, which I thought so much of once. And now it was long past noon on a September day, and we stopped to change horses for the last time at a little smoky town, all full of colliers and miners. Mrs. Rosamond had fallen asleep, but Mr. Henry told me to waken her that she might see the park and the manor house as we drove up. I thought it rather a pity, but I did what he bade me, for fear he would complain of me to my lord. We had left all signs of a town or even a village, and were then inside the gates of a large wild park, not like the parks here in the north, but with rocks and the noise of running water and gnarled thorn trees and old oaks, all white and peeled with age. The road went up about 2 miles, and then we saw a great and stately house with many trees close around it, so close that in some places their branches dragged against the walls when the wind blew, and some hung broken down, for no one seemed to take much charge of the place to the top to lock the wood or to keep the moss-covered carriage way in order. Only in front of the house all was clear. The great oval drive was without a weed, and neither tree nor creeper was allowed to grow over the long, many windowed front, at both sides of which a wing projected, which were each the ends of other side fronts. For the house, although it was so desolate, was even grander than I expected. Behind it rose the fells, which seemed unenclosed and bare enough, and on the left hand of the house, as you stood facing it, was a little old fashioned flower garden. As I found out afterwards, a door opened out upon it from the west front. It had been scooped out of the thick, dark wood for some old lady Furnival, but the branches of the great forest trees had grown and overshadowed it again, and there were very few flowers that would live there at that time. When we drove up to the great front entrance and went into the hall, I thought we should be lost. It was so large and vast and grand. There was a chandelier all of bronze hung down from the middle of the ceiling, and I had never seen one before, and looked at it all in amaze. Then at one end of the hall was a great fireplace, as large as the sides of the house in my country, with massy andirons and dogs to hold the wood, and by it were heavy old-fashioned sofas. At the opposite end of the hall, to the left as you went in, on the western side, was an organ built into the wall and so large that it filled up the best part of the end. Beyond it, on the same side, was a door, and opposite on each side of the fireplace were also doors leading to the east front. But those I never went through as long as I stayed in the house, so I can't tell you what lay beyond. We're going to stop there. It's getting really close to the good part, so don't go away. Come back for part 2.